I'm very happy to be here for the first conference or a lecture for the exhibition A Taste for the Renaissance, a dialogue between the collections, which has been organised here by the Thani Collection and the Centre du Monuments Nationaux and the Victorian Albert Museum in London. So I should just explain briefly a little bit about the background of the exhibition. It's the second in a series of collaborations between the Thani Collection and the Victorian Albert Museum. The first exhibition, The Medieval Treasures, when the English spoke French, ran until the 7th of January. And in this exhibition, A Taste for the Renaissance, we exhibit some of the Renaissance treasures from the Victorian Albert Museum, alongside some of those from the Thani Collection. The V&A's extraordinary Renaissance collections and their outstanding breadth are shown together with the rich and varied Renaissance works from the Thani Collection, bringing the collections together in discourses that explore the place of art and collecting, connoisseurship and taste that formed the formation of famous collections in Renaissance Europe, and their memory in collecting practices from the late 18th to the present day will be explored by me in this lecture today. As Ferdinand de Rothschild commented in his Reminiscence of 1897, old works of art are rare, and they are precious because they are rare. And when they are beautiful as well as their possession, their possession becomes doubly desirable. Drawing on objects exhibited in this beautiful exhibition, my lecture will explore the origins and interests of 16th century collectors and later owners, curators and dealers whose evocative personalities provide an engaging framework through which to consider the rich history of these objects. So I'm presenting here a couple of images of the medieval and Renaissance galleries at the Victoria and Albert Museum as they are seen today. You can see in this image one of the beautiful Lady and the Swan, which is on display in the galleries, alongside some of the more monumental pieces in the collections. When the lantern, the 16th century Venetian lantern you see hanging down, when it was first seen in London in the middle of the 19th century, one journalist commented with a romantic and evocative view of the lantern as it might have been seen in the 16th century. And he writes, "There swings as it did 200 years ago when St. Mark's bell tolled for the death of Foscari, or on rough nights when the spray of the lagoon broke over the marble steps and splashed the smiling faces of its cedar seraphs." It gives us an idea of the way, the sort of the romantic view of the past that was being conjured up by some of the journalists writing at the time. And in the second image, you see again some of the more monumental pieces of Renaissance art that were collected by the V&A, principally during the mid-19th century. Many pieces were sourced from Europe, from all over Europe, and as a result, the V&A's Renaissance collections are extending in their breadth and depth. And you can see in the centre of this image, Samson and the Philistine by Jan Malonga, a Flemish sculptor working at the Medici court in Florence, and created this between about 1560 and 1562. So the Thani Collection holds a rich array of metalwork and hearthstones, exotica and portraiture. Many of the pieces on display here would have been treasury pieces for the private art collection or used at banquets to create a glittering array of precious materials. And you have a few images of some of these pieces on display in the galleries that you'll be able to see. So some of the exotica. You have to read it quite small. Of the most ample theatre that houses exemplary objects and exceptional images of the entire world, so that one could rightly call it a repository of artificial and marvellous things, and of every rare treasure, precious object, construction and picture. It is recommended that these things be brought together here, so that they frequent viewing and handling, one might quickly, easily and confidently be able to acquire the unique knowledge and admirable understanding of all things. This writes the Belgian physician Samuel van Quijberg, who was acting at the time as art advisor to Duke Albrecht V of Bavaria. And this was the beginning of his Inscriptiones, written in Munich in 1565. And here is a portrait of him from about the same time. So the Inscriptiones are the earliest known treatise on museums, and it describes the idea of a princely curiosity cabinet, a model for the Kunst- und Wunderkammer of the Bavarian Duke in Munich. The buildings created to house his famous collection were constructed between 1552 and 1567 with a Renaissance facade, and it was used on state occasions when dignitaries were conducted through rooms of wonders, marvels, and exceptional paintings, in an exercise that promoted the status of the Bavarian duchy and the reputation of its ruler. Krichberg outlined how the collecting of objects connected knowledge and art and science and were linked to the governing of a state, and in grouping objects and comparing them helped to make the world intelligible and understandable. This is an image of the building where the collection was displayed. As well as being a wealthy ducal court, Munich sat at the crosspoint of centuries-old traditional routes linking Imperial Vienna with Royal Paris and the Electorate of Saxony and Dresden and the Grand Ducal House of Florence. The Munich Palace, known as the Residence, on several occasions hosted a Habsburg ruler on his way to his coronation as emperor in Frankfurt, or travelling to the imperial city of Augsburg. So you can see how displaying his exceptional art collection to visiting dignitaries was an extremely sort of pointed exercise in promoting his status. In 1565, a description mentions it's at the collection's arcaded courtyard seen here, and a formation of cloister-like ambulatories with 4 wings comprising of several floors to house nearly 3,500 items. So the passion for collecting the extraordinary and mysterious was cultivated at extraordinary levels during the 16th century. This was in part influenced by imperial collections from Europe's classical past. Suetonius, who died in 122 AD, recalls that the Roman Emperor Augustus had his houses embellished not only with statues and pictures, but also with objects which were curious by reason of their age and rarity, like the huge remains of monstrous beasts that had been discovered on the island of Capri, called giants' bones and heroes' weapons. Private art collections demonstrated their owners' encyclopedic interests and broad humanistic knowledge, all of which projected the collector's social status and the dynastic glory. Elaborate displays of beautiful, rare objects reinforced a ruler's what is called his virtues or his worth, and thus art collections celebrated dynastic glory. On the Italian peninsula, the space housing these objects was could be called a stanzino, a studiolo. More often, it could be a museo, or sometimes they were called galleria. And the name mostly applied in varying degrees to collections of paintings and works of art, but they could contain curiosities, such as the Medici Galleria. And in the north, as we just seen, north of the Alpines, we tend to be called the Kunst- und Wunderkammer and various other iterations of this, generally to expand how they contained exceptional pieces of art and curiosity. The collections varied in size and audience, we've seen, from the private spaces for study shared only with intimate circles of friends to more public spaces like that of Albrecht V in Munich. This is an image of the studiolo from the Ducal Palace in Gubbio, which is now in the collections of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But it gives you a sense of the intimate space, and it was made from marquetry called entrastia, which using inlay to create these wonderful trompe-l'oeil views of cabinets, open, half open, ajar, to show the collections of the sort of the imagined collections of the erudite and knowledgeable Duke. You can see here 2 of the cabinets where on display are, you can see a garter, the sign of the garter, which was the form of the English chivalric order that was bestowed on many of the key rulers of medieval and Renaissance Europe. a jeweled fly whisk, collections of books, and model of the stars and the planets. And this is one of the earliest depictions of one of these sort of museums of knowledge and curiosity and art, and it's an engraving depicting a Renaissance museum created by Ferrante Imperato in Naples. The image was engraved in 1599. You can see the huge range of objects, including the crocodile hanging from the top of the ceiling, displayed in cases and on shelves and all over the roof. Further images to give you a really rich sense of these spaces. This is the Kunst- und Wunderkammer of the Prince Archbishop of Salzburg, who reigned at the late 16th and early 17th century. Some of the redisplays of his cases give you a sense of the juxtaposition of globes, ostrich eggs, coconut shells, medallions, and sculpture. And also the encyclopedic collection and all kinds of objects that were put together to show this sort of knowledge of the world. And this is an image from the medieval and Renaissance galleries at the V&A that shows a recreation, an imagined recreation of the studiolo that was Studietto, that was created for Piero de' Medici in the 1450s. The 12 roundels that have been placed on the ceiling were part of his Studietto, and they depict the labours of the month, and were made by Luca della Robbia between about 1450 and 1465. So again, it's in this case, it was a small, intimate room intended for study and contemplation, and the display of the most precious objects in the Medici's collection. They included lavishly illuminated books, classical coins, cameos and vases, medieval ivories, goldsmiths' works, and it was known he owned a tiny painting by Jan van Eyck. So Piero della Medici suffered from gout, and so as a result was often had to remain indoors. And he is said to have been carried to his studietto, where he spent many hours contemplating the collection. And that's what's being recreated in this display. The roundels were originally set into a pattern of green and purple tiles, which represented the dynastic colours of the Medici family, red and green. So again, the theme of the labours of the month probably highlighted the unalterable cycle of the seasons and the natural order of the world, and could also be potentially interpreted as a metaphor for the continuity of the Medici regime. The Studietto was described by a Florentine architect in about 1465 as being decorated with most worthy figures, so that everyone who entered was filled with admiration. I'm now going to show you a series of pieces that are on display in the exhibition that would probably have been contained, either known to you, or would probably have been contained in a treasury or a studiolo for the admiration and of the owner, and also potentially to be shown to their privileged guests. So many of the objects on display give insight also into the types of objects that were kept in these private collections. They demonstrate skill, virtuosity, and the inventive use of materials by the artist, but they also showed how the collector would have admired and appreciated them for their skill. This small statuette of the Greek hero Meleager was made by the 16th century sculptor Pier Jacopo Bongolowski, known as L'Antico, for his works, which were inspired by classical models. Meleager was probably created for a member of the Gonzagas at Mantua, and is thought to be the figure of metal called the Little Peasant, listed in the inventory in 1496. That was the name that the antique model was known as when it was before it was destroyed in the 18th century. The inventory was made after the death of Gianfrancesco Gonzaga of Bozzolo, and who was the third son of the Marchese Ludovico Gonzaga of Mantua. This object is a globe, this mechanical globe clock was bought by the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II in 1584 and housed in his imperial treasury in Prague. The globe served as a model for the universe, simulating the movements of the sun and the moon and the stars, and it could predict the movements of celestial bodies at any time of the past and the future, and could tell the time by the position of the stars. So for the learning and the educated art collector, the three ingredients for success in showcasing their encyclopedic kind of knowledge and broad learning were naturalia, products of nature, artificialia, or artefacta, the products of man, and scientifica, the testaments of man's ability to dominate nature. And this is represented in astrolabes, clocks, automatons, as well as scientific instruments. So clocks like this would have been housed alongside these objects of science, celebrating human ability to control the natural world. You can see in this the finely engraved dials, the enamel clock faces, and the elaborately cast support. It was bought primarily for its craftsmanship and technical ingenuity. These were the height of luxury items and designed to impress guests as well as educate through their mechanical workings. Rudolph II had one of the most famous of the 16th century collections of all, and born in 1552, he was the King of Hungary and Bohemia, and from 1576, Holy Roman Emperor. And under his guidance, Prague became one of the leading centres of the arts and sciences in Europe. The European maritime exploration to the Americas, Asia, and Africa provided the source of natural materials such as nautilus shells, ostrich eggs, coconuts, and elephant tusks, and objects of trade such as porcelain that provided a platform for European goldsmiths to display their skill. These luxury objects had both decorative and functional and practical functions, and often used as part of elaborate table settings for banquets. As a container for salt, the nef on the right was created in the form of a 16th century galleon and would have been placed by the guest of honour at a banquet. And the beautiful unicorn cup on the left, again has a sort of dual purpose as an art object and something that could potentially function. Portuguese dominance in maritime connections with South and East Asia ensured that the most magnificent and luxury pieces of exotica were acquired by the Portuguese royal family. This casket is one of a group of at least 9 caskets known to have been produced by the rulers of Cote as diplomatic gifts for the Portuguese royal family in the mid-16th century. And as these ivories were being brought to Portugal, so engravings and books were circulating. And in this image in the exhibition, we place a Jura model for the image of the bagpipers that you see on the casket, so you can understand the exchange in artistic models that is passing through the merchants travelling by sea. This casket and its particular iconography is thought to have been made around 1557 as a gift for the Portuguese following the King of Cote's conversion to Christianity and the birth of an heir to the Portuguese, an heir and a grandson to the Portuguese King John III. The earliest known casket in this group was acquired by the Fugger family for Duke Albrecht V of Bavaria before about 1579 and had been sent as a part of the first embassy from Cote to Portugal. The mission of 1542 was led by Cote's court chamberlain and Brahmin chaplain, who learned to speak fluent Portuguese during his sojourn in Lisbon. On his return to Sri Lanka, he assumed the role of art agent, procuring luxury ivories, precious stones and jewels for the Lisbon court, where they were particularly appreciated by the Queen Consort Catherine of Austria, who was a passionate collector of art and exotica. Catherine's acquisition of luxury objects from Portuguese Asia reflected her social status at the Lisbon court, and after her arrival to Portugal in 1525, she was soon acquiring ivory fans and caskets, textiles, Chinese blue and white porcelain and lacquer, mother of pearl objects from Gujarat and India, and these were detailed and itemized in her inventories. And Catherine's collection became the first significant Kunstkammer in Renaissance Portugal, comprising more non-European objects than any other contemporary collection before the mid-16th century. And these are two examples, one from the Thani Collection and one from the V&A, of the mounting of these porcelain pieces that were being brought from China, and then set with the most extraordinary goldsmith work in Europe. Other types of object that we would have seen in the private art collection include hard stone pieces made of rock crystal, lapis lazuli, such as this tiny exquisite bucket that's on display in the exhibition, but also virtuoso ceramics and glass were also important collectors' pieces and provided a new form of art object for the 16th century collector that was as much to be admired as potentially have a function. And this turquoise glass cup was probably made by a Venetian glassmaker called Obizio, who's recorded as creating some of these turquoise vessels in the late sort of 15th and early 16th century Venice. And like it's designed in terms of its really rich turquoise colour to evoke an object, a cup made of itself with the hard stone turquoise, and then it's been gilded and decorated, sort of evoking, in a way, the mounting of a hard stone object in gold and silver gilt. And this piece from the Thani collection, which is a remarkable work of art, which is the antique Roman bust of the Emperor Hadrian, made about 117 to 138 AD. It was owned by Frederick the Great in the mid 13th century, when its beard was altered, then mounted in the 16th century in Venice, with a bust made of enamelled and silver gilt. I think it's silver gilt armour, and then again further mounted in the 19th century. So you see how the passage of these objects through time, they remain part of the treasury and part of the art collector's prize works of art. This piece by a follower, probably of Bernard Palissy, again shows the extraordinary virtuoso skill that was being used to create objects for display and admiration. The life cast animals that decorate these platters are extraordinary and show, again, the interest in the natural world. This, again, painting in Maiolica also reached astonishing levels of skill and sophistication, and were again part of this elite art, this elite art market. This plate, part of the V&A's collection, is part of a service made for Isabella d'Este Gonzaga, and has been finally painted by Nicola da Urbino, who's perhaps one of the greatest of all Maiolica artists. In the centre of the dish, the coat of arms of d'Este Gonzaga is framed by Putti, with Isabella's motto and symbols inscribed on the balustrade. The actual narrative tells of its tale of Hippolytus and Phaedra, which is depicted around the rim. On the 15th of November 1524, Eleonora, Duchess of Urbino, wrote to her mother, Isabella d'Este, in Mantua, saying, "I have ordered a service of earthenware, since the masters of this land of ours have some reputation for good craftsmanship. I shall be pleased if your excellency likes it, and you can make good use of it at Porto, as it is something suitable for a villa." So we don't know for sure, but this plate perhaps is one of the pieces from this service and this gift. So in England, as in Europe, the practice of forming erudite private art collections as a symbol of taste and knowledge was also practiced in the refined and cosmopolitan court of the Tudor and early Stuart monarchs. We are left with an idea of the richness of Henry VIII's art collection, which was spread across 55 royal palaces and survives in the inventory made in 1547 on his death. Other famous collectors included Thomas Howard, the Earl of Arundel, who created one of the most famous art collections of the late 16th and early 17th century. This writing box that's on display, is emblazoned with the arms of the royal arms, and was probably made, we think it was probably made for Henry VIII, and a number of these boxes appear in that inventory of 1547. It's a wonderful piece of work with heads depicting Troy and Paris and Helen of Troy. We have the kind of the extraordinary grotesque work and a sort of combination of Renaissance decorative style and sort of late medieval English decorative motifs, such as the quatrefoils that you can see decorating the little drawers below these grotesques and these classical heads. So Henry VIII's palace at Nonsuch in Surrey was intended to be a Renaissance palace without compare, hence its name Nonsuch, and it was built to rival Francis I's Chateau d'Achambord. Just to sort of give you an idea of the environment in which these pieces were being enjoyed and created for a visitor in the reign of Queen Elizabeth describes Nonsuch and says, "There are so many miracles of perfected art and works which rival those of ancient Rome, that which complete satisfaction the place has been given the name, which means nulli secunda in Latin. Sitting in the hall, there is a collection of sculptures representing stories from Ovid. After mounting the steps, one sees a picture of a Roman eagle. The finest in the whole of England, and exceedingly beautiful it is. In the garden of the labours of Hercules and a number of other subjects from the poets are most beautifully portrayed. There are also marble obelisks, the grove of Diana, the fountain of Diana. A spring rises, Diana and her 2 nymphs bathe, Actaeon gazing lecherously at Diana, she with a slight gesture of her hand towards him, slowly changing his head to that of a stag, and his hounds were in close pursuit." It gives you an idea of the decoration and the grounds in which this palace was set. So I mentioned the sort of situation of the Renaissance art in England being, in part, Henry VIII was inspired by his rivalry with Francis I of France, but also he had grown up in a cosmopolitan court. His father, Henry VII, had spent much of his youth in France and northern Europe, and his court was full of a wide variety of different nationalities. This was the same of the court, of the artistic culture of the court of Henry VIII, and is exemplified by these 2 bronze angels made by Benedetto da Rovezzano, who was an Italian sculptor working at the Tudor court. They were commissioned by Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, Henry's chancellor, in 1524 for a magnificent Renaissance tomb. It was never realised, as he fell from favour after he'd failed to acquire a divorce for Henry from Catherine of Aragon. And subsequently, the angels, there are 4 of them, were taken by Henry VIII for his own tomb designs, which again were sadly never realised. This page from a design of armour for the Elizabethan court by the master armourer Jacob Halder. It's from the Royal Armouries. Again, show the kind of international nature of the artistic culture of the Tudor courts in the 16th century England. The fashion for German armour in Tudor England was established during the reign of Henry VIII, and each of the pages of this document show the most notable, the most important commissions for the most fabulous and fashionable pieces of armour that would have been worn by the favourite courtiers in the Elizabethan court. This one in particular was made for the Duke of Cumberland, and its original survives in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And again, I mentioned Thomas Arundel, the great sort of art collector from the late 16th and early 17th century. And this piece from the Thani Collection was owned by Arundel, as known as the Arundel Zodiac. It was probably, it's a very rare 16th century intaglio of a zodiac, and pictures Jupiter with an eagle flanked by Mars, Mercury, and Neptune underneath. And it was probably bought by Arundel in 1536 from a Flemish merchant and connoisseur called Daniel Nijis, who had sold famously sold the Gonzaga paintings to Charles I. It probably came from the court at Mantua, although we don't have, like with many of these things, we're fairly certain, but we don't have the we don't have the document that tells us exactly. But it's a great treasure of this exhibition and shows the international nature of art collectors and artists working through this period in history. Gems and jewellery were also a great subject for collecting, as the zodiac shows. And this great treasure, 16th century treasure from the V&A, is known as the Heneage jewel, after a suggestion that it was owned by Sir Thomas Heneage, who died in 1595, a Privy Councillor and Vice Chaplain to the royal household of Queen Elizabeth I. This is a type of jewellery that was designed to be worn by a courtier, perhaps for a formal portrait, or at court, who either sought the Queen's favour or wanted to demonstrate their loyalty and allegiance. Occasionally, they might have been given as gifts or commissioned by the courtier themselves, but it's exceptionally rich object with a cameo of Queen Elizabeth on its front and its face, a symbol of an empress. Whereas, and inside you open up the locket to reveal a more intimate and sort of graceful image of the Queen. So, on the other side of sort of the private, intimate sort of portraits, we have this Hilliard miniature of an unknown man against a flaming background. So miniatures, like all jewels and miniatures, were designed really to be held close to the body, as he demonstrates with the jeweled portrait that he holds in his hand. And he turns it towards his heart and towards his open fronted shirt. So these small portraits were often given as gifts, as symbols of love and tokens of affection, and I think that's clearly demonstrated here with the passionate flaming background of burnished gold and his semi attired state. So, having looked at sort of collecting art and for the private art collection or for the private individual in Renaissance Europe, I'm going to look towards the kind of history of collecting, and the stories of some of the later owners of these extraordinary treasures from this rich and the rich and beautiful art of this period. So many of the objects that have survived from the great and famous art collections were prized as much for their illustrious provenance as for their artistic value of the piece. The skill of the artist, the extraordinary levels of refinement and craft have ensured the survival of remarkable pieces, and the collectors who have preserved these pieces for generations. The Foster Codex, which is one of the great treasures from the V&A, is a beautiful example of this. It's one of about 22 of Leonardo's notebooks that survive and were made during his lifetime. And in his own words, he describes at the beginning of the Codex Arundel that this particular volume was begun in Florence in the house of Piero di Boccaccio on 22nd of March, 1508. This is a gathering of notes in no particular order taken from numerous pages which I have copied here, in the hope that I will later place them in proper order, according to the subjects they treat. And I think that before I reach the end of this, I will have repeated the same thing several times. But reader, do not blame me, because things are numerous and memory cannot keep them all, and say, this I do not wish to write because I have already written it. Might resonate with many of his here, but the vast array of subject matter contained in these notebooks covered engineering, optics, anatomy, botany, hydrodynamics, astronomy, and they provide precious windows into the eclectic interests and working mind of this exceptionally talented polymath. So the Codex Foster contains 3, which is on display at the in the galleries, contains notes taken between 1490 and 1493, when Leonardo was in the service of Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan. It came to the V&A via John Forster, who was a book collector and a friend of Charles Dickens. But the survival of this piece follows a number of different figures and shows how treasured these notebooks were from the moment that Leonardo owned them. So he gave them to his pupil and friend Francesco Malzi, who kept them after his death, and they were later owned by Pompeo Leone, the sculptor at the Spanish court of Philip II. The notebooks were given to Forster by his friend and the career diplomat Edward Bulmer Lytton, who probably acquired them in Vienna, where he spent some considerable time. And it's been thought that perhaps they came to Austria from Milan via the Barnabite priest Giovanni Ambrogio Mazzenta in the 17th century, who may have founded the Barnabite College of St. Michael in Vienna. And we know that Mazzenta was also an architect who collected Leonardo's manuscripts and wrote, in the last years of his life, was the author of Le Mémoire sur Leonardo da Vinci. So it's through many of these figures that these objects have been passed down to us today and treasured continually. And this is no less the exception of family heirlooms, particularly those connected with some of the most connected to gifts from some of the most important historical kings and queens. This is a Sri Lankan bracelet from the mid-16th century that was given as a gift from Elizabeth I to her cousin, Henry Carey, who was the first Baron Hunsdon. And the memory with which this object has been treasured, it's still owned by the same family, the descendants, can be seen in this bequest from the will of George Carey, who was the son. So long as the conscience of my heiress shall have grace and honesty to perform my will, for that I esteem them right jewels and monuments worthy to be kept, for their beauty, rareness, and for that money they are not to be matched, nor the like yet known to be found in this realm. So an understanding of how these were treasured and admired can be seen from the very outset, which explains why so many of these pieces have survived. In a similar tradition, the wild jewel has long been associated with a lace christening robe that was also given and said to be given by Elizabeth I to her goddaughter, who was one of her maids of honour. And again, this is now a piece from the V&A. It was always shows that continuing a family tradition. So following political upheavals in Europe in the late 18th century and the dispersal of many royal, aristocratic and ecclesiastical art collections, there saw an astonishing rise in passion for collecting in 19th century Europe and a revival of interest in Renaissance masterpieces and the study of art of Renaissance Europe. This was particularly important in England, and from it originates the creation of the outstanding collections of Renaissance decorative art and sculpture at the V&A. In England, art collector, historian, amateur architect and man of letters Horace Walpole did a great deal to further study of 16th century art and was a great collector of antiquities, paintings and decorative art displayed at his fantasy Gothic castle he built between 1749 and 90 by the River Thames in Twickenham. That's pictured here in the watercolour. These images show the insides of the castle in the late 18th century. And some of the pictures he had arranged on the walls. Walpole promoted the study of English Renaissance art in a tradition that echoed the study of European art from Vasari and his followers. And he collected many miniatures of famous historical figures and many works by Holbein, as well as these miniatures by Hilliard, shown in this beautiful painting of Elizabeth I. Walpole's collection was sold at auction in 1842, and a great sale took place in April. Was one of the most famous art sales in the 19th century, taking place in the grounds of the house over 24 days. And in the sales this tazza is described a magnificent tazza and cover enamelled in the most exquisite style, both inside and out, with subjects portraying the history of Samson. Was made in Limoges by the enamel artist Jean Perregaux II, and is finely painted with grisaille enamels, muted greys and fleshy tones, with some gilding on the dark background. Walpole's collection only included a small number of pieces of Limoges enamel, and at the time they were less fashionable and appreciated than they would become in the 19th century. But what Walpole owned illustrated his fine aesthetic judgment. Sales of important collections of Renaissance art formed in the aftermath of the European wars and revolutions of the late 18th and early 19th century, provided further opportunity for museum curators, art collectors, and a steadily increasingly competitive marketplace. Walpole's rival collector, William Beckford, purchased his tazza and passed it to his daughter, who was married to the Duke of Hamilton, and eventually acquired in the late 19th century by Australian art collector George Salting, who bequeathed it along with his extensive collection of medieval and Renaissance decorative art to the V&A. Also part of this bequest was this Maiolica plate, which had been part of the collection of the British politician Ralph Bernal and sold at another great sale of his collection at Christie's in London in 1855. These pieces were among 749 objects from the collection of the Toulouse lawyer Jules de Soulage, mainly comprised of 15th and 16th century Maiolica and Palissy ware, exceptional pieces of Saint-Pourchaire ware, Venetian glass, ivories, bronzes, Limoges enamels, medals, medallions, painted glass, textiles, tapestries, furniture, paintings, and Della Robbia ware. An extraordinary collection. In 1856, the English pottery owner and manufacturer Herbert Minton drew Henry Cole's attention to the collection. Cole was the first director of what would become the South Kensington Museum. At the time, it was called the Museum of Manufactures. And Cole brought the collection in its entirety to the V&A's early premises at Marlborough House, and the subsequent purchase of the collection, as well as number of acquisitions from the Bernal sale, helped to form the basis of V&A's extraordinarily rich collection of Renaissance decorative arts. These two images show the early 19th century views of the museum, but they illustrate how kind of a key Renaissance pieces were, and the Renaissance aesthetic was to the early museum. Unlike the royal collections that form the basis of the national collections in Paris and Madrid, the V&A's collection grew out of a renewed interest in the importance of good design as a basis for creating modern manufactures. Following the Great Exhibition in London of 1851, what is then called the Museum of Ornamental Art, began acquisitions of historic objects to educate and inform the public. These, and as I said, these two images show the importance of that aesthetic in the early days of the museum. The watercolour shows the cases of the banal, the Soulage collection as it was displayed in the late 1850s, and the black and white images shows, amongst other works, the plaster cast copy of Michelangelo's David that was a gift to Queen Victoria from the Grand Duke of Tuscany in 1857. So early museum collections aimed to facilitate the study of the very best objects of human creativity, and the art of Renaissance Europe in its form, ornament and aesthetic was seen as a kind of pinnacle of excellence in by many high-profile figures in the mid-19th century. And this quote, which is taken from the Grammar of Ornament produced by Owen Jones in a chapter written by Matthew Digby Wyatt, says, "Even the greatest Raphael himself did not disdain to design ornament for carvers in the purest taste and most exquisite fancy." And this was important because Raphael was then held to be the greatest of the old masters, and this provided inspiration for the designers of decorative arts. Prince Albert, the Prince Consort, was also a strong supporter of the early museums collecting and of the Renaissance art, and he was instrumental in the permanent loan to the V&A of the Raphael cartoons from the Royal Collection. The original designs, these were the original designs made by Raphael for the tapestries in the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican, commissioned in 1515 by Pope Leo X. Prince Albert had described Raphael as the greatest and noblest genius in the history of art, reflecting what I just commented on about his status in the 19th century Europe. And in 1865, in memory of the Prince Consort, who died in 1860, the Queen gave the Raphael cartoons on permanent loan to the museum. And these are just some old photographs of their display, and also the huge crates that move these objects from the Royal Collection to South Kensington. And an image of Prince Albert by Winterhalter. And again, the Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were great supporters and gave many objects to the early museum's collections, including this charming boy playing the bagpipes by Andrea della Robbia, which is on display in the exhibition. John Charles Robinson, along with a network of contacts and agents sourced from Europe, many objects to increase the museum's collection of Renaissance masterpieces. Robinson was superintendent of the art collections at South Kensington between 1852 and 1868. During that tenure, he created what would become an encyclopedic collection of Renaissance sculpture and decorative art. I'm not going to read this here, but it just shows you some of contemporaries' appraisals of his skill and of his relentless and tireless work across in collecting pieces. So this Michelangelo wax was bought from the Garandini collection in 1854. This, one of the most famous sculptures from the V&A, the Virgin with the Laughing Child, was acquired by Robinson in the late 1850s in Paris. He also acquired on site in Italy the Santa Chiara Chapel and this huge Della Robbia stemma of King Rene of Anjou. On the ground in Italy at the time, many sculptures were being dismantled or offered for sale from deconsecrated and religious foundations or buildings undergoing major renovation. And being on site to be able to acquire them, he says, describes the difficulties and the process. He says the acquisition of specimens of Renaissance sculpture indeed is a work of difficulty. Unlike most other works of art, for obvious reasons, they do not fall into the hands of dealers. They must be diligently sourced from the land of their production, and it is only when ancient buildings are altered or destroyed that works of monumental sculpture can be obtained from the original locations. Marble mason shops, gardens, the courtyards and porticos of palaces and villas may still yield interesting fragments of minor work of so movable a nature. One of the very famous collections that Robinson was able to acquire works from was the Gili Campana collection in Rome, which in 1857 the head of the Vatican, the Papal Bank, the Monte de Pietà, had been jailed in a scandal involving his embezzlement of funds from the bank in order to create his absolutely extraordinary art collection. And it was impounded with that of his dealer, the collector, the collector Gili, and hence known as the Gili Campana collection. Robinson was on the site at the time and spent very quickly contacted back in his contacts in England in order to acquire funds to buy many of these works, which include the Combat of the Warriors, which is on display in the exhibition, and this Donatello, the Ascension of Christ, and giving keys to the keys to St. Peter, which is one of the most exquisite Donatello works in the collection. Robinson was also very well aware of the private collections that were had been created and were being continually created by subsequent generations of collectors. And in 1862, he organised an exhibition at South Kensington, which created was an extraordinary range of objects from the museum, as well as those still in private hands. And he describes evocatively that to see this more tranquil atmosphere of how the artist's mind and labour of a life can spiritualise material, can transform iron into delicate filigree, more precious than gold, and give priceless value to the fragile pottery, and make a little slab of carved ivory more valuable than many tons of metal, show his appreciation for and eye in presenting this material. Many famous, as I've mentioned, many famous pieces of decorative art from private collections in England were displayed at this exhibition, and included the rock crystal bracelet and the wild jewel. They show the knowledge of the curators, dealers, and collectors was circulating at the time, and has helped to sort of preserve some of these treasures. One of the famous pieces on display in the 1862 exhibition was this partridge cup created by Georges Roulle in Nuremberg in the late 16th century. It's an exquisite piece made of with mother-of-pearl feathers, with garnets and semi-precious stones. It was the poster piece of the exhibition and featured in the London Illustrated News. It, as a work of art, at the time it was owned by Lionel de Rothschild, and many of the pieces in the Thani collection also share some of the Rothschild collecting histories. It was bought in 1988 by Sir Arthur Gilbert and his wife Rosalind, and formed part of their extraordinary late 20th century Schatzkammer, or treasure collection. It was acquired via a London. It was acquired. In 1996, the Gilberts left their entire collection to the British nation, and it's now on display in dedicated galleries at the V&A. In 2001, Gilbert was knighted and chose this object to be his mascot, and it became the centre of his coat of arms. Just checking, I haven't gone over time. So this, as I mentioned, the Rothschilds, many private collectors helped preserve these works of art, and including a number of the Rothschild family. And this picture, they're all dressed in Renaissance outfits for recreation. The Baron Ferdinand and Leopold are dressed for the 18th-19th century Devonshire fancy dress ball, where pretty much all the participants were dressed as famous historical Renaissance characters. In 1897, Ferdinand collected in his memoirs his experience of collecting, called his Reminiscences, and they provide extraordinary insight into the dealers and collectors that form the network of around himself, his friends and family. Frederick Spitzer, who's featured here on the far right, he featured alongside other important collectors in these memoirs of 19th century Paris. And they show Ferdinand's intense curiosity about the dealers he met, as well as suspicion of their activities, where he dubbed them le bande noire. And Spitzer owned these two Aldrovandini Tazza, that one of which belongs to the V&A and one of which belongs to the Thani Collection. They're on display in the galleries. You can look at them together, which is a rare treat. They were in the 19th century, in the mid-19th century, they were owned by Spitzer, and they were had their bases altered. And replaced in a style that he considered more kind of Renaissance, and they're a reminder to some of the improvements, or additions and changes that were made to many of these pieces over time. And they are pictured on display in the galleries. And this rather long, and I'm not going to read all of it, anecdote by Ferdinand talks of his experience of Spitzer when he was an early collector, and he sort of describes himself as being green, and Spitzer comes to him and asks if he can provide him with some more medals, and in turn he provides him with some jewels. So they were exchanging goods and exchanging opportunities to acquire pieces, but as Ferdinand describes, some of those pieces were a mixture of modern and 16th century pieces that had been changed or designed in the 19th century. It says, I think, he says at the end, I had acquired more knowledge of 16th century art. I discovered that the jewel was not made up, and that I had been handsomely done. But at that time, Mr. Spitzer was wearing his decorations in heaven, while I was left to reflect on the gleefulness of human nature, a wiser, though sober man. Again, these as a piece from a beautiful rock crystal fountain from the Thani collection that I think passed through numbers of different collectors, including Sybil Chomley, who was quite a big collector of a number of several pieces that are in the Thani collection. And I'm just going to sort of finish here with this last quote from Ferdinand. He says, "The mind of a dealer is fertile in resources and ingenious devices, and he well knows what particular device the occasion renders it advisable to employ. If the owner of the article he covets, but may not have some difficulty in securing, be of a timid or nervous disposition, then instead of an argument or persuasion, he uses strong language, shouts at him as if he were deaf, and rushes to him so impetuously that rather than stand the ordeal any longer, the owner submits and sells." Thank you very much for your attention.